For centuries, the galaxy had measured power in fleets and firepower, and ancient bloodlines, and the Zorathian Empire was the oldest proof of that belief. Its banners were stitched with victories, its history written in conquered systems, and its emperor had never needed to explain himself. When the imperial envoy arrived in the Sol Council chamber, the air itself felt thinner, as if even oxygen understood hierarchy. The envoy did not sit. He stood tall, elongated frame wrapped in ceremonial armor that reflected the faces of human delegates back at themselves. His voice carried without amplification, sharp and precise, each word designed to cut rather than persuade. He announced that humanity's recent expansion beyond agreed boundaries was an act of defiance, that treaties were permissions granted by the strong, not rights owned by the weak. He spoke of consequences, of corrective action, of how quickly a lesson could be delivered, if needed. The message was clear and delivered with the confidence of a civilization that had never been forced to reconsider its assumptions. The chamber remained silent after he finished. Cameras hovered, translating, broadcasting across human space. Millions watched, expecting fear, outrage, or submission. Instead, the human representative stood slowly, not rushing, not reacting emotionally. Elias Verne had not been chosen because he was the loudest voice or the most charismatic. He was chosen because when systems failed and models collapsed, he was the one who stayed calm and counted what remained. He did not look at the envoy at first. He looked at the data slate in front of him, as if confirming something trivial. Then he raised his eyes, meeting the alien's gaze without challenge or apology. He thanked the envoy for clarity. He said that threats were useful because they revealed intent without the need for interpretation. He explained that humanity had listened carefully, not just to the words spoken today, but to the pattern behind them. He spoke of borders and treaties not as symbols of weakness, but as tools of efficiency. He reminded the chamber that humans were latecomers to the galactic stage, and because of that, they had been forced to innovate rather than dominate. They did not inherit ancient fleets. They built networks. They did not rely on singular rulers. They relied on distributed decision-making. He stated calmly that while the Empire measured power by how loudly it could threaten, humanity measured power by how quickly it could adapt. The envoy's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. This was not the response he had anticipated. He had expected pleading or defiance, not analysis. Across human space, military analysts rewound the broadcast, focusing not on what was said, but how it was said. Verne never raised his voice. He never insulted the Empire. He simply laid out a series of facts. Human trade routes no longer depended on a single corridor. Energy production was decentralized. Command structures were designed to function even when severed from leadership. He did not reveal secrets. He revealed philosophy. The Empire believed breaking the head to kill the body. Humanity had learned to survive without a head at all. The envoy interrupted, calling this arrogance disguised as wisdom. Verne smiled faintly and agreed that arrogance was dangerous, which was why humans preferred redundancy over pride. The meeting ended without a declaration of war, but also without peace. In the imperial court, the emperor watched the recording in silence. He was ancient, even by his species standards, a being who had seen stars rise and empires fall. His advisors spoke nervously, suggesting immediate shows of force, limited strikes to remind humanity of its place. The emperor raised a clawed hand and silenced them. He replayed one sentence again and again, the moment when the human said that threats revealed intent. To the emperor, threats had always been tools, but he had never considered that they might also be liabilities. For the first time in centuries, he felt uncertainty, not as fear, but as irritation. On Earth, the public reaction was divided. Some praised Verne for standing firm. Others accused him of provoking a superior power. Protests formed in major cities, demanding transparency, demanding reassurance. In private briefings, Verne explained to select leaders that escalation was inevitable but controllable. The Empire would test humanity, because that was how it validated its worldview. The key was not to prevent the test, but to survive it in a way that forced the Empire to update its assumptions. He compared it to an old human concept from game theory, where the goal was not to win immediately, but to change the rules, so that future games were played on different terms. The first test came sooner than expected. An Imperial patrol entered a peripheral human system, not attacking, merely inspecting, asserting presence. Human ships did not engage. They rerouted traffic, adjusted schedules, and within hours, the system functioned as if the patrol were invisible. No confrontation, no spectacle. Imperial commanders reported confusion. Their presence had produced no submission, no outrage. It was as if their threat had been absorbed without effect. The Emperor listened to the report, claws tapping against his throne. He ordered a second test, this time economic. Tariffs, blockades, pressure on allied species. Again, humanity responded, not with speeches, but with results. Alternative markets activated. Supply chains shifted. The pain was real, but distributed. Never concentrated enough to cause collapse. Within the Empire, younger strategists began to whisper that this opponent was different. Not stronger in the traditional sense, but resistant in ways that made traditional strength inefficient. The Emperor convened his inner circle and spoke openly of the human response. He admitted that they did not behave as expected. Some advisors urged adaptation, others urged overwhelming force before the anomaly became a precedent. The Emperor deferred the decision, something he had rarely done. He wanted to understand the humans better, not out of respect, but necessity. Meanwhile, Verne prepared for the next phase, knowing the Empire would escalate. He authorized projects that had been theoretical until now. Not weapons, but infrastructures of response. Communication meshes that could not be silenced. Civil defense protocols that treated disruption as normal, rather than catastrophic. He addressed the public again, not with reassurance, but with instruction. He told them that uncertainty was not the enemy, paralysis was. That results mattered more than rhetoric. His approval ratings fell even as system resilience increased. When the Empire finally struck, it was precise and devastating by conventional standards. A major human shipyard was destroyed in minutes. Images flooded the networks, commentators declaring it a turning point. The envoy returned, delivering a message from the Emperor himself. This was restraint, the envoy said. Proof of mercy. Further resistance would lead to annihilation. Verne watched the footage of the destroyed shipyard, noting what the Empire had missed. Production had already been moved. The shipyard was symbolic, not critical. He met the envoy again, and thanked the Emperor for demonstrating exactly how the Empire fought. He said the data was invaluable. The envoy's composure cracked for the first time. He demanded to know what humanity wanted. Verne answered simply that humanity wanted the same thing it had always wanted. The ability to pursue its future without being frozen by someone else's past. He said that threats were expensive and results were scalable. That if the Empire continued to speak in threats, humanity would continue to respond in outcomes that made those threats increasingly irrelevant. The meeting ended with no handshake, no resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. As the envoy departed, Verne stood alone in the chamber, aware that the hardest part was still ahead. He had forced the Empire to think, and thinking was dangerous. Empires that thought too late either adapted or broke. Humanity was betting that this one would do the former, but preparing for the latter. Across the galaxy, observers began to understand that this conflict was not about territory or pride, but about competing definitions of power. The other worked quietly and expected survival. And for the first time in a long time, the galaxy was no longer sure which approach would win. The aftermath of the strike rippled through the galaxy. in ways the Empire had not predicted, and humanity had quietly prepared for. Because while the destruction of the shipyard dominated feeds and fueled outrage, the systems behind it adjusted with mechanical calm, rerouting labor, reallocating materials, and updating production schedules as if the loss had been a scheduled outage rather than an act of war. And this difference between perception and function became the central fracture line of the conflict. In the imperial court, the emperor listened to reports that contradicted one another. Intelligence officers describing human morale collapsing based on intersected broadcasts, while logistical analysts admitted that output numbers barely dipped before stabilizing, a contradiction that unsettled him more than open defiance ever had. Because empires were built on the assumption that fear translated directly into compliance. And here, fear seemed loud but ineffective. He summoned the envoy back, demanding a clearer assessment. And the envoy for the first time hesitated before speaking, explaining that human systems did not behave like imperial systems, that there was no singular pressure point to exploit, only layers that absorbed damage and redistributed strain. And the emperor's irritation deepened into something colder. The realization that overwhelming force might still win, but at a cost that would echo for generations. On Earth, Elias Verne convened a council not of admirals or politicians, but of systems engineers, sociologists, and crisis managers. Because the next phase would not be decided by a single battle, but by endurance under sustained stress. And he told them plainly that the empire would escalate not because it was cruel, but because it was consistent with its own identity. An empire that did not press its advantage ceased to be an empire. So the goal was to survive escalation long enough to make continued pressure irrational. He authorized selective transparency, allowing controlled leaks of recovery timelines and adaptive measures, not to boast, but to normalize resilience, teaching the population that disruption was survivable and temporary. And slowly, the panic shifted into grim determination. Not heroic, not cinematic, but practical. The empire escalated economically again, targeting neutral species that traded with humans, applying pressure that had worked countless times before. But humanity responded by accelerating a policy they had debated for years, investing heavily in mutual aid agreements that prioritized stability over profit, offering technology transfers and infrastructure support instead of military protection. And while this did not immediately replace lost trade, it created something more dangerous to imperial dominance, a network of interdependence that reduced the effectiveness of coercion. Younger imperial advisors warned that this was how influence slipped away quietly, not stolen, but rendered obsolete. But older generals dismissed the concern, insisting that visible power still mattered. And so the emperor approved a demonstration meant to remind the galaxy of hierarchy. A fleet maneuver near a densely populated human system. Weapons charged, but unfired. A silent reminder of potential devastation. The broadcast was meant to terrify, and for a moment, it succeeded. But then something unexpected happened. Civilian traffic rerouted calmly. Emergency protocols activated without chaos. And within hours, daily life continued under the shadow of the fleet. Not because people were brave, but because they had been trained to treat threat as background noise, rather than a call to surrender. Analysts across the galaxy began to note a subtle shift in language. Commentators stopped asking when humanity would capitulate, and started asking how long the empire could justify the expense of maintaining pressure with diminishing returns. The emperor watched these analyses with growing anger, not at humanity, but at the erosion of narrative control. Because empires thrived on stories as much as on ships, and the story was slipping from his grasp. He requested a private channel to Elias Verne, something unprecedented, a conversation without envoys or audiences. And when the connection opened, the two figures regarded each other across the void, not as enemies in that moment, but as representatives of incompatible systems. The emperor spoke first, abandoning ceremonial language, asking why humanity refused to acknowledge reality. why they pretended that power could be diffused without consequence. And Verne answered not with philosophy, but with history, recounting how humans had survived disasters not by centralizing authority, but by allowing failure at small scales to prevent collapse at large ones. How they had learned through pain that no single victory guaranteed safety, only adaptability did. He said the empire was strong but brittle, magnificent but expensive, and that humanity did not need to defeat it, only to outlast its willingness to pay the cost of dominance. The emperor responded with a threat, reflexively, promising annihilation if humanity did not submit. And Verne nodded, acknowledging the possibility, then stated calmly that annihilation was a result, not a strategy, and that results had consequences beyond intent. He pointed out that the Empire's threats were already reshaping the galaxy, encouraging others to quietly adopt similar resilience models, not out of loyalty to humanity, but out of self-preservation, and that even total victory would leave the Empire ruling a quieter, more cautious, less profitable galaxy. The Emperor ended the call abruptly, shaken not by fear, but by the realization that the human was not trying to win the argument, only to ensure that every imperial action produced outcomes the Empire disliked. In the weeks that followed, skirmishes erupted at the edges of human space, limited and contained, each one analyzed not for heroism, but for data. And each time, humanity lost something visible, while gaining something structural, improved protocols, faster recovery times, better coordination. And this asymmetry began to frustrate imperial commanders, trained to measure success in destroyed assets, rather than degraded enemy capacity. Within the empire, dissent grew quietly, merchants complaining of shrinking markets, governors questioning the wisdom of endless pressure, and the emperor found himself spending more time arbitrating internal disputes than planning conquest, a sign of strain he could not ignore. On Earth, Verne prepared his final move not as a dramatic gesture, but as an offer, proposing a renegotiation of treaties based on mutual non-interference and economic cooperation, not as a plea, but as an option framed by data, showing that continued conflict would cost the empire more than accommodation. And when the proposal reached the imperial court, it split the advisors deeply, some seeing it as a trap, others as a face-saving exit. The emperor retreated into private deliberation, alone with centuries of tradition pressing against a rapidly changing reality. And for the first time, he considered that the greatest threat humanity posed was not its fleets or technology, but its refusal to play the role assigned to it. A refusal that forced the empire to confront the possibility that power, defined solely by the ability to threaten, was no longer sufficient in a galaxy learning to value results over rhetoric. The decision, when it finally came, was not announced with fanfare or threats, but with silence. A pause so long that analysts on both sides began to suspect deception, because empires were supposed to speak loudly, even when uncertain. And humanity had learned that silence often preceded change. In the imperial court, the emperor emerged after days of seclusion, looking older, not weakened, but worn by calculation. And he dismissed the council with a single order that stunned the room. All forward operations against human space were to be suspended pending review. A phrase that sounded temporary, but carried the weight of retreat. And though no one dared say it aloud, everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The fleets remained in position, but their weapons powered down. And across the galaxy, observers marked the moment as the first time in recorded history that the Zorathian Empire had chosen not to escalate when escalation was available. On Earth, Elias Verne received the transmission without celebration, instructing networks to treat it as provisional rather than victorious, because he understood better than anyone that empires rarely collapsed in a single decision. They eroded through accumulated exceptions to their own rules. He convened the same quiet council that had guided the response from the beginning, and reminded them that restraint from the empire was not peace, but opportunity. A window in which habits could change and assumptions could harden into new norms. Humanity moved quickly but not visibly, expanding cooperative frameworks with neighboring species, formalizing redundancy agreements, and codifying crisis response protocols into shared standards that others could adopt, turning what had been improvisation into infrastructure. Because if the empire resumed pressure later, it would find not an isolated opponent, but an ecosystem less vulnerable to coercion. Within the empire, the suspension ignited unrest, not among the masses, who were insulated from most consequences, but among elites, whose fortunes depended on predictable dominance, merchants who had built careers on imperial leverage, generals whose identities were tied to forward motion. And as they argued, the emperor listened more than he spoke, recognizing that the greatest risk now was internal fracture, rather than external challenge. He authorized studies, a dangerous concession, asking strategists to model long-term outcomes, not of victory, but of sustained competition with a resilient adversary. And the projections were unsettling, showing not catastrophic defeat, but gradual dilution of influence, a slow normalization of defiance that would make future threats less effective everywhere. The emperor summoned the envoy once more, not to deliver demands, but to ask a question that would have been unthinkable months earlier. What did the humans want beyond survival? The envoy admitted uncertainty, explaining that humans did not articulate destiny the way empires did, that their goals shifted with context, prioritizing continuity over glory. And the emperor dismissed him, realizing that he was confronting not a rival emperor, but an entirely different conception of success. He requested another private channel to Verne, and when it opened, there was no ceremony, only two figures framed against their respective worlds, and the emperor spoke without menace, asking whether humanity understood the risk of undermining an order that had, however brutally, maintained stability for centuries. Verne replied that stability enforced by fear was efficient but fragile, and that humanity did not seek to dismantle the empire, but to make it irrelevant as a source of existential threat, arguing that an order that could not tolerate adaptation would eventually shatter under its own rigidity. The emperor countered that adaptation required authority, that diffusion led to chaos, and Verne answered that chaos was not the absence of control, but the absence of preparation, and that humans had learned to prepare for failure rather than deny it. The conversation ended without agreement, but with mutual recognition that neither side could easily eliminate the other without unacceptable cost, a realization more binding than any treaty. As weeks turned into months, the galaxy adjusted to the new normal. Trade resumed cautiously, patrols avoided provocation, and the empire's silence slowly lost its edge as others grew accustomed to it. And this normalization was perhaps the most profound change of all. On Earth, the public never received a single triumphant announcement, only incremental updates about resilience metrics improving, response times shortening, and dependencies decreasing. And while this failed to inspire dramatic pride, it cultivated something more durable, confidence rooted in process rather than promises. Within the empire, dissent continued to simmer, and the emperor faced a choice that no predecessor had confronted so clearly: reform or repression, adaptation or doubling down. And he knew that either path carried risk, but only one offered a future where threats still meant something. He initiated limited reforms, framed as efficiency improvements rather than ideological shifts, decentralizing certain logistics, granting regional governors more autonomy. And while these changes were modest, they signaled an acknowledgement that the old model was straining. Hardliners accused him of weakness, whispering that humanity had corrupted imperial resolve, and plots were rumored, though never proven, forcing the emperor to balance caution with authority, a delicate act that consumed energy once spent on conquest. Humanity watched these developments without interference, understanding that pressure applied now could unify imperial factions against a common enemy, and patience remained a strategy, Patience backed by preparation. Years later, historians would debate the moment the balance truly changed. Some pointing to the destroyed shipyard, others to the suspended offensive. But many would argue it was the day the empire stopped speaking only in threats, and began calculating results it could no longer control. Elias Verne eventually stepped down, not in disgrace or glory, replaced by a system designed to outlast individuals. And when asked in a rare interview what victory looked like, he answered simply that victory was waking up without needing to fear someone else's words. In the imperial court, the emperor aged visibly, burdened by the knowledge that his reign marked the end of an era where power was unquestioned. And though the empire endured, it was changed, less absolute, more cautious. And in that caution lay both its survival and its loss of myth. The galaxy moved forward not into utopia, but into complexity, where no single voice could dominate without consequence. And the lesson spread quietly from system to system, that speaking in threats might command attention, but shaping outcomes commanded the future. And in that future, humanity did not rule, did not conquer, but persisted, proving that sometimes the most disruptive force was not the one that shouted the loudest, but the one that kept working when the shouting stopped. In the years after the crisis faded from headlines, the galaxy learned that the most dangerous changes were not announced, they were normalized. And humanity's influence spread not through declarations, but through templates quietly adopted by others who had watched and taken notes. Trade hubs rebuilt themselves around resilience metrics rather than imperial favor. Communication standards emphasized redundancy over speed, and crisis drills, once considered excessive, became routine across dozens of species, not because humans demanded it, but because the results were undeniable. Systems that bent did not break. Within the empire, the old language of absolute dominance still echoed in ceremonial halls. But in practice, governors negotiated more, commanders calculated costs more carefully, and threats were issued with qualifiers that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Each small concession defended as pragmatism, yet collectively amounting to a transformation no single decree could have forced. A new emperor eventually ascended, younger and educated in the shadow of the standoff. And while he honored tradition, he also understood the lesson written between its lines. The power which could not tolerate resistance would exhaust itself in forcing silence. Humanity never claimed authorship of this shift, never framed it as victory, and that refusal itself became a form of influence, because it denied rivals the clarity of opposition, and denied allies the comfort of dependency. When disputes arose, humanity offered process rather than protection, frameworks instead of fleets. And while this frustrated those who wanted decisive intervention, it cultivated a culture where stability was shared rather than imposed. The memory of the destroyed shipyard remained, not as a wound, but as a reference point, a reminder that visibility and importance were not the same thing, and that sacrificing symbols could preserve substance. Children on Earth grew up learning not the names of battles, but the logic of systems, taught that survival was an active practice rather than a heroic moment. And this education quietly shaped a generation, less impressed by spectacle and more attentive to outcomes. In imperial space, a similar shift occurred, more slowly and with greater resistance. But even there, academies updated curricula, adding case studies that analyzed the human response without naming it admiration, focusing on adaptability as a strategic variable rather than an anomaly. Some officers dismissed these lessons as academic, yet those who ignored them found their commands increasingly brittle in the face of decentralized challenges that refused to present a single target. Across the galaxy, the phrase "the human spoke" became a proverb, translated into dozens of languages, not as a slogan, but as a caution, that threats revealed intent, but results revealed capacity. And those who internalized it found themselves planning differently, investing in resilience instead of intimidation. Humanity continued to make mistakes, to stumble, to argue internally, but those failures were absorbed, and recycled into improvement rather than denial, reinforcing the pattern that had first unsettled the empire. Decades later, a minor border incident flared briefly, and observers held their breath, expecting escalation. Yet the response was measured, collaborative, and fast, resolved through shared protocols rather than displays of force. And when it ended, most citizens barely noticed, because peace maintained through competence rarely felt dramatic. Historians would later write that the era of unquestioned empires did not end with a war, but with a comparison. A side-by-side demonstration of two philosophies exposed to the same pressure. One that relied on fear to compel obedience, and another that relied on preparation to endure disruption. The galaxy did not become gentle or just. Conflicts still erupted, and power still mattered. But the meaning of power shifted subtly and permanently, away from who could threaten the most, and toward who could keep functioning when threats failed. Humanity never ruled the stars, and never needed to, because its greatest contribution was not conquest, but proof. Proof that survival could be engineered, that stability could be shared, and that the quiet work of building systems often outlasted the loud work of breaking them. And in that long view, the galaxy found itself changed, not by a single voice raised in defiance, but by countless actions taken calmly in its wake.